Hello. Your vessel is talking to you. Are you listening? I'm thinking of offering private stability and trim lessons using Zoom. My goal is to fill the gaps the license exam questions and the required license training does not cover concerning the management of your vessel's stability and trim. Would you be interested? If so, please give me an email at williamegeorge@gmail.com. Thanks a lot. Bye. Hello. This is podcast number 17. It's still on trim. It's a little bit more in detail this time. If you're following along with the book, the trim chapter is chapter 9. It's on page 187. Right now we're at page 208. And I'm going to start with a section entitled Working the LCG Method Backwards to Find the Vessel's Actual LCG. This is a technique I found years ago that wasn't taught at schools. What it is basically reverse engineering, where we're going to read the drafts first and see what the drafts tell us to find the LCG instead of using weight moments. In this case, instead of using the weighted average to find the LCG and then calculating the trim, we're going to actually determine the true trim from reading the drafts. And then we're going to simply work it backwards without doing a weighted average, without knowing how much fuel is in the tanks, without knowing how much ballast is on board, without knowing even where the cargo is. Because the truth of it is, as long as the ship is free floating, the ship knows the answer. You just have to ask it. And this is why I have this recurring theme. Your vessel is talking to you. Are you listening? Now, you cannot talk to your vessel basically by looking at the computer screen in your loading computer. What you have to do is actually go read the drafts. The drafts, to me, are no different than a doctor taking a patient's temperature, blood pressure, temperature, just to see how it's doing. So in this case, the ship will tell you its condition as long as it's free floating. So the LCG of the vessel can be found for any draft by a simple calculation, and this can be illustrated in figure 9-8b. Suppose, for the example, the ship is trimmed by the stern. The vessel's center of gravity, G, must be aft of an even keel position to the center of gravity, which would be at B, LCB. And this is the key to understanding this. If you have the hydrostatics that assume zero trim, the LCB of those hydrostatics is the required LCG for zero trim. And we can use the same steps for English units or metric units. The only difference is the units we're using. So for English units, once you determine the trim, which is the difference between the forward and aft true drafts, not apparent drafts, what we do is we multiply that trim in inches by MT1 or in centimeters by MTC, and this will result in the trimming moment. Now, the trimming moment is basically the trimming arm, the distance between LCB and LCG, times the weight of the vessel or the vessel's displacement. And again, for metric units, multiply the trim in centimeters by MTC. And this will result in a trimming moment in meter metric tons. And if we multiply the trim in inches by MT1, we're going to get foot long tons. Divide the trimming moment now by the displacement, And this will give you the trimming arm. Now the trimming arm is the distance from LCB to LCG. Remember that the trimming arm is the horizontal distance between LCB and LCG. Look up the LCB in the vessel's hydrostatic data for the observed mean draft. Now, again, if the vessel has multiple hydrostatic tables, such as -1 meter down by the head, 0 trim, 1, 2, or 3 meters by the stern, you have to make sure you're using the proper table. But in this case, this works for the 0 trim hydrostatic table. You look up the LCB of the ship's hydrostatic table for the observed mean draft. Now, remembering that G will always be between B and the deep end of the vessel, to calculate the LCG, you basically have to add the trimming arm to the position of LCB toward the deep end of the vessel. And in the book, it says it may be helpful to draw a simple sketch. Now, it's more than helpful. I think it's essential because you have to be able to map this out so you see what you're doing. The LCB can be located on some ships from the after perpendicular forward. On other ships, it can be from the forward perpendicular aft. Still, on many new foreign-built, Asian-built ships, it can be at midships, halfway distance between the forward and after perpendiculars. And usually negative is the forward direction and positive is the after direction. You can tell this by inspecting the plans of the ship. So basically, if you have a general arrangement in the ship's office, you can actually point right at where the LCB is, and if the ship is trimmed by the stern, the LCG will be the distance from LCB to the LCG using the trimming arm. And how do we get the trimming arm? It's simply the trimming moment divided by the displacement of the vessel. How do we get the displacement? Well, if we can look up the mean draft, we can get a displacement close enough to give us a very good answer because it's such a large number compared to everything else. And that's a very good trick. And sadly, it's not taught at maritime schools. Maybe after people listen to me, they will start teaching it. But when I went to school, it wasn't taught to us that way. They were having us enough trouble teaching us from the top down how to do the calculation. Now, the other day, on the other podcast, I mentioned this top-down calculation, and that's simply LCG minus LCB is the trimming arm. The trimming arm times the displacement is the trimming moment. The trimming moment divided by MT1 or MTC is the true trim. And that's all there is to it. So what are we doing with this paragraph or two in page 208 in Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer? We're just saying let's do it in reverse order. And I'll repeat it one more time. The reverse order is you read the drafts, determine the apparent trim, correct the apparent drafts to the forward and after perpendiculars by taking the apparent trim per unit length and adjusting the drafts forward and aft to the perpendiculars. The difference between the drafts at the forward and aft perpendiculars are the true drafts. The difference between these true drafts will be the true trim. The true trim divided by MT1 or MTC will give you the trimming arm. If you look up the LCB, the position of the LCB, measure from the LCB toward the deeper end of the ship, and that'll be the position of LCG. So, if the trim is 0, there's no place for the LCG to be but at LCB. And that's sort of an interesting thing. Now, there's some other things in the book that are sort of curious. The effects of trim on transverse stability. This is page 202. And here, it is an interesting and instructive fact that trim has an effect on transverse stability. The initial stability of a vessel depends on the value of the metacentric height, GM, and the weight. If a weight is shifted so as to trim the vessel by the stern or the head, the assumed kg remains the same. The only effect on transverse stability comes from the change in km. The value of km is determined by the value of kb and bm. Are there any changes in the latter values due to trim? When the vessel is trimmed by the head or by the stern, the value of kb increases because b moves forward or aft, and it will also rise. And there's a figure on 9-7 on page 203 that illustrates this. So the B will actually shift toward the deep end, and it will rise slightly, which probably isn't that much, but it will rise. The biggest thing, though, is when you look at the form of the vessel, if you trim a ship by the stern, it usually, the water plane area broadens as the draft increases aft. Whereas the form, if you trim the ship by the bow, the bow doesn't, you lose more area aft than you gain forward, and the ship goes down by the head. As the vessel trims by the stern, therefore, there is a rapid increase in waterline area aft and a decrease forward. The result is an increase in total waterline area. Hence, the moment of inertia of the waterline increases, and if the moment of inertia of the waterline increases, basically the metacentric radius will increase. So as the metacentric radius increases, which is bm, km will increase, typically. So this is a combined effect of kb and bm. If the vessel trims by the bow, what happens? BM could be reduced just because it's narrower at the forward end than the after end. And KB will increase, but BM will be decreased a lot more. I've had experience with a lot of ships loading logs, and if they get down by the head, the next step is they end up with a list. So it's good not to let the ship go by the head. The other reason you don't want to trim the ship by the head is, or the bow, is the suctions in the ship's tanks are at the aft end, and once you trim it by the head, all that liquid that normally sits at the aft end of the tanks runs forward, and you can't pump it out anymore. So if you load cargo so you're down by the head, you might have to take a lot of ballast aft to get control of the vessel again. So it's always best to manage the vessel where it's no more than even keel or by the stern. But you really don't want to trim the vessel by the head while you're doing cargo operations. Some ships do sail with the ship trimmed by the head a little bit because they're trying to save fuel, and they actually believe that there's better fuel conservation. When you start to put the power to the ship, it basically squats a little bit. So if it's trimmed by the bow to begin with, it will change a little bit just with the hydrodynamic effect on the particular hull you have. Okay, what else can we look at glancing through here that I didn't cover the other week?